Welcome, guys. So, we're continuing our unit on industrialization, and today's lesson is going to focus on two things. And this is actually two lessons in one. So, typically, I would split this out over the course of 2 days, but I can fit both lectures onto one video here. So, first of all, starting off, the first lesson is going to focus on the rise of labor unions. And the important objective to understand here is to analyze labor unions, why they were necessary, and the methods that they used to achieve better working conditions and better rights in the working environment. However, before you go on to the notes, your preview question is going to focus on the title of this era. So, as we continue to learn about the era of industrialization, think about what you would call our current era in the United States, and then write one paragraph describing why you would name it that, well, what you would name it, and why you would name it that. So this is something that can be really fun and interesting. Make it interesting. I've heard a lot of things referencing technology, referencing politics, referencing the this feeling of political correctness or people being easily offended. I've heard lots of different perspectives, both positive and pessimistic, regarding the current state of the country. So I want to hear your opinions from you guys, what you believe you would call our current time period, and I want you to be able to tell me why. And if you have any questions about this, we'll talk about it in class. For now, we're going to move on to the notes. So today's focus, once again, is on labor unions and why they were necessary. And it's important to understand that the relatively high standard of living that we enjoy in the United States today is because of the efforts made by labor unions and working class people to both unionize with the companies and to force the employers to provide better working conditions, and also to organize to elect government officials to pass regulations designed to improve working conditions as well. So, first of all, let's talk about some of the poor conditions that existed in the United States during the era of industrial revolution. So we focus a lot on the growth of the economy, which was a massive amount of growth, and we focused a lot on the wealth and success of guys like Carnegie, guys like John D. Rockefeller. But we have not yet talked about how it affected negatively individuals in American culture. So that's the big focus here. First of all, if you were an industrial worker, the salaries were extremely low, so low that usually the parents had to work, both parents had to work. Usually children had to quit school and go to work as well. And even then, it was very difficult to make ends meet. People were typically living paycheck to paycheck. And a big issue there, too, was a lot of people, especially if you're an immigrant and you were low income, people were looking to find ways to rip you off, whether it was how much you paid for housing, or how much they paid you or the way they treated you at work. People were looking to take advantage of you and rip you off because there was no protections legally for people. So it was very easy to scam people. By the way, a great book to read is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It gives you kind of that perspective of what it's like to be an industrial worker in the United States, which we'll be talking about him more later on in this unit. All right, in addition to children having to go to work and child labor actually being legal during this time period, the work days and the amount of work you had to do on a weekly basis was not sustainable for the long term for anybody, without eventually getting sick or getting hurt. People worked 12 hours a day on average, sometimes more, sometimes less. They worked 6 days a week. They got no vacation time, no sick leave, no unemployment compensation, and no reimbursement for injuries suffered on the job. And injuries suffered on the job is going to be a major problem because the factories are dirty, they're poorly ventilated, the equipment is dangerous. It was not uncommon for people to lose arms, to lose legs, to even die in these factories. It was very frequent. As a matter of fact, in the year 1882, 675 laborers were killed in work-related accidents every single week. So this is a huge problem, and this is, once again, one of the reasons why workers are going to organize together and to demand better pay and better benefits and better treatment from these companies, as well as organize for politicians, uh, elected officials to advocate for better rights for working class individuals. So, on average, salary wise, to put it in perspective, men made about $498 a year back then, and women made $267 a year back then, and children made about 27 cents a day. These are averages. Generally, even today, it's still technically legal to pay a woman less than a man, but that gap is much smaller. I believe it's something around for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes about 80 to 85 cents, I believe, is the number. So once again, it's still not equal now, but even back then it was even worse. And it was just simply legal to pay you less because you're a woman. So women often worked in manufacturing, maybe not in the steel mills as frequently, but they did work in the manufacturing of textiles and things like that. So women did do long hours in manufacturing jobs, but they were simply just paid less. And as far as today's gender gap, you're going to hear a lot of different perspectives about why that exists. Um, you know, you'll hear guys like John Stossel. He always likes to play the devil's advocate in regards to economics. He says that, well, women make less than men today because they're more likely to take vacation time or spend time with their children or things like that. Um, while those like President Obama, who have advocated for laws to guarantee equal pay for men and women, would argue that even doing the same job for the same amount of years, with the same amount of experience, same amount of hours, women still earn less than men, dollar per dollar. So there's two different sides of that, and that's one of those things that you got to look into and do your own research on and figure out your opinion on it. Anyways, as far as the labor unions, three famous examples of labor unions that you need to know and their leaders is the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, who was also, by the way, a socialist and one of the most famous socialists to run for president in U.S. history. Even though he only gained something like 1% of the vote, he was still very popular. And we're going to talk more later on about why socialism may have been a popular idea if you were an industrial worker. And then finally, the Industrial Workers of the World was a low skilled union, so miners and other low skilled workers. They were a socialist union as well. Labor tactics. What did unions do to achieve what they wanted? Three main things: boycotts, strikes, and collective bargaining. Now, boycott is when you abstain from buying industry products. So if a company was treating its workers in an unethical way, unions would try to organize boycotts of buying that company's products in order to get the company to meet their demands. Because if you organize a strong enough boycott on a company that it's actually hurting their profits, then they might consider sharing a bigger piece of the pie with their employees. To go back to the wages thing before, guys like Carnegie making $23 million a year, and the best paid workers are making on average $498 a year. So that's a huge gap between the extremely wealthy and the workers. And the fact is Carnegie can't make $23 million a year without his workers, which is going to be another reason why labor unions are, when they do band together, they do have power. And another way in which they can band together for power is organizing a strike. So that's the organized stopping of work by laborers. Two of the more famous strikes you need to know about is the Pullman strike, which involved railroad workers, and the Homestead strike, which involved steel workers. And we're going to actually dig deeper into the Homestead strike in tomorrow's lesson, which you're going to take notes on today if you're watching it through YouTube. We're going to dig deeper into that by watching a video about the Homestead strike and answering a few questions about that. Finally, collective bargaining is the process that unions would use in which they'd sit down with the managers and they would negotiate wages and hours and working conditions. And collective bargaining is still something that takes place today in any unionized company. It's both common with public unions and in private company unions. I'm a teacher, so our union sits down with the county every year and they negotiate pay, they negotiate healthcare, things like that. And if you have any family members or friends who are police officers or firefighters or teachers, their their union does the same thing with the county as well. And once again, it's not just public unions that are a thing. There's also private companies that still have unions and use unionized workers as well and have to do collective bargaining. The United Auto Workers Union is a famous example of that that's still around today. Those are workers at Ford and Chevy. Recently in Tennessee, the workers at the Volkswagen factory tried to unionize as well, though it didn't work out. So yeah, that's modern day examples. Last slide. As far as tactics from the other side, what did management try to do? Blacklisting, lockouts, and yellow dog contracts were their three main strategies. So blacklist was a do not hire list of laborers involved in unions, strikes, and boycotts. So they would share lists of people who were had past union membership and people who were particularly active as a way of deterring other people from joining unions. Lockouts are very similar to strikes. It's really just a battle of who can be the most stubborn. Who's willing to lose money and not be able to, if you're the owner of the company, who's willing to lose money and market share the longest versus the worker who's willing to go without, being able to feed their family or pay their bills the longest. So obviously the Carnegie of $23 million a year has got an advantage there. Anyways, that's when you refuse to allow your employees to come back to work until they've accepted all conditions. And sometimes, too, they'll hire scabs, which are replacement workers. And then finally, yellow dog contracts are when employees agree ahead of time not to join unions. Moving on to our response, you need to look over this quote. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement and why? And the statement is, quote unquote, unregulated capitalism exploits workers and resources and leads to unequal social classes. So you need to write 3 to 4 sentences in one paragraph, either agreeing or disagreeing with this statement. Moving on to the next lesson. So typically, we would do this over 2 days, but I'm trying to get it all into one video. So you need to draw this cartoon and tell me what these 3 people represent. You need to tell me why the U.S. is closed. You see it here covered in cobwebs. You need to think about what the negative effects are when a strike occurs. What are the effects that has on an economy? Think about trade, think about wages, think about spending, stuff like that. And then finally, does the artist have a negative or positive view of labor unions and or capitalists, and explain why? Finally, last slide of notes for the second part of the notes. Very short, actually. The topic is socialism. We talked about capitalism. It's important that you also understand what the meaning of socialism is. So before I told you that capitalism is when an individual opens a business, meaning any of you guys can start a business and make profit from that. Socialism is the collective ownership of business. So that means that it's owned by the government or owned by the public, and they all own it together and they all take a relatively proportional share of the company depending on how much work they do for that company. Karl Marx is the creator of the idea. He believed that capitalism exploited workers and led to unequal social classes, and he believed that a workers' uprising is inevitable. So the goal of socialism is to redistribute the wealth and to end all social classes, which is communism. Now, it's important to understand that a recent guy who ran for president, Bernie Sanders, he called himself a socialist, but by this definition, he's not. He would ideologically line up with the Social Democrats in Germany or the Labour Party in the UK, but typically, if you go by the textbook definition of what a socialist is, Bernie Sanders would not fit into that category. So real socialism is supposed to be government owned, but it doesn't necessarily have to be authoritarian like you see in the Soviet Union or North Korea. It could also be the UK, which is not a socialist country, but they have socialized healthcare where the insurance and the hospitals and the doctors all work for the government. That's technically socialism. All right, moving on. Make sure you get these questions copied down. And the video, if you're on my classroom website, scottxhistory.weebly.com, the video is right below here. Otherwise, go to the website to find the video if you're watching this just straight up on YouTube. But write down these questions. Watch the video on the Homestead strike, which is below here if you're on my classroom website. And you're going to answer these questions about Carnegie's public view of unions versus private. Frickin' Carnegie, who did they hire? The effects of the Homestead strike, and do you think the workers have the right to take over the mill? So that is what you're going to be doing next. So this ties into the idea of Karl Marx's workers rebelling.